Tonight we're going to talk about why is assessment difficult. I think that there's a lot of complexity to assessment. We're going to unpack some of those ideas. How does assessment impact or improve learning? How we can lead whole school assessment and some practical ideas about approaching that. And leading data meetings. So if you're a teacher, a PLC leader, a unit leader, a faculty leader, you might be in the position of leading data meetings. And so we're going to give some practical ideas about how you can do that effectively. Okay, this is weird. I know. Go with me here. Whenever I do a presentation, I'm really conscious of what image we put on slides. I know for cognitive load, we shouldn't have slides that have lots of text. Sometimes we might just use stock images or photos. An assessment can be kind of dry for me to present about. So I wanted to give you something different. It is the end of the year. So we're going to be looking at some optical illusions. Just go with it. All right. Trust me. Trust me. I've got a plan. So here we have an optical illusion. This is from David Novick, who's the professor of engineering education at the University of Texas. And so have a look here of the coloured spheres and what colour each one is. I'll give you a minute to have a look. See, Jeanette's thinking hard. So the spheres are actually all the same colour of beige, but our mind is tricked by the horizontal lines. It adds colour when there actually isn't any. So let's take a bit of a closer look. If I zoom in here, you can sort of see now that the spheres are actually the same colour. So assessment can be a little bit like looking at this illusion. We think that we should just be able to compare students, apples to apples, or at least easily measure what students have learnt. Surely we can just give everyone a test that has the same questions and then the assessment is done. But assessment's actually really difficult. So the assessments that we choose and design, the inferences that we draw from these assessments and the actions we take can really lead us in schools in different directions. And we know that two teachers can look at two students who have sat the same assessment and draw really different conclusions about the data. Okay, so it feels like it should be really simple. If I've just taught a unit on fractions, I should be able to ask my student Oscar to sit a test and respond to questions about fractions. And then I should be able to draw an inference about his answers to assess what he knows. And then I should be able to compare Oscar to his desk partner sitting next to him. But we know assessment is rarely this easy. So I might write questions in a history assessment that Oscar knows a lot about, but doesn't really capture what his desk partner Sienna knows a lot about. And this might be even more magnified if they're not in the same class. So one test might not capture what two different students have taken away or learnt from one unit. Now, realistically, they might know the same amount of content, but I can't spend endless one-on-one time with every student trying to ascertain exactly what they do and don't know. However, I've designed a paper test is going to prioritise some content over others. Now, in some schools, we might write an assessment after we've done the unit and taught the unit, and there might be some inconsistencies between what classes have actually taught. And so some students will have an advantage over others because the test might have more content that they were taught compared to the other class. Oh, I've gone back a slide. Oh, I've gone way too many slides. Wait a second here. Oh, man.
It's all right, Sash, you're doing well.
Sorry, me and my slides don't want to be friends. Here
Everything
we
you
go.
said is absolutely spot on so far.
Of course. All right, here we go. So ultimately, we have to contend with all these compromises when we're doing assessments, don't we? So to make assessment work in schools, there's a few things that we have to compromise on. So one of the first issues we have is scale. So in general, we have to have assessments that can be delivered to many students at once. Sometimes hundreds or thousands of assessments of students will be sitting the same assessment. And this then means in many cases, we have to design assessments that might rely on something like multiple choice or short answer rather than doing a one-on-one interview. And this is really important because we do need assessments to be marked easily and consistently. And in a school, we also need assessments to be marked quickly. It takes a really long time to individually mark lots of long, interviews or long answer responses. And so this is one of our first compromises. A lot of the time assessments, we need to be using multiple choice or short answers, which is positive for marking consistency, but also can really limit the amount of information we can gather. Now, this scale issue, it doesn't necessarily mean that our assessments are bad or that don't have an important purpose. We do have to create assessments that are scalable because we do have to provide some accountability. It helps for a school or a system to be able to look at this consistent data and assess whether or not we're meeting, the outcomes we should be meeting and what our strengths and areas of improvement are. So if an assessment's not scalable and we can't give it to large groups of students, we actually lose the ability to have a bigger picture. And so at the core of a scalable assessment, we have to think about consistency. So we have to have assessments that are consistent so we can create data that is comparable. And one way that we do this is with standardization, which helps data use and fairness and helps us track students or cohorts and compare groups to groups. But consistency can also be really difficult because who gets to design these assessments, especially in schools where we might be designing our own assessments to meet what we're trying to teach. So who decides what goes into that content? Do we know whether that content has been taught consistently across classes? And especially in a broad subject with lots of content, who decides what's kind of worth more? So we have to make sure that our assessments are scalable and consistent, but there's some compromises we have to make and decisions we have to make about what goes into them. And of course, the big thing that I know I hear a lot about at my school is that assessments take a lot of time. Sometimes we do have to do a one-on-one interview, especially with younger students. And the compromise we make is time. We know that working with younger students, that's a trade-off. We do sort of need to hear them read aloud or give us their answers, but that also is going to really impact instructional time. So that's a compromise. Here's our next illusion. Where is it a duck? Is it a rabbit? Is it both? And this is my analogy for learning versus performance. Because another challenge we face when we're designing assessments is the difference between learning and performance. We know from Sweller that learning can be defined as a change in long-term memory, and this means that learning develops over a long period. So we can measure what students remember right now, straight after we've done a lesson, a couple of days after we've done a lesson at the end of a unit, but we do have to also think about whether we're assessing learning or performance, and some of that comes down to the spacing from when we give the assessment and also the format. So what does this mean for us in general? It means that we need to think really carefully about whether our assessments are assessing short-term performance or whether they're assessing student learning. So in summary, what makes assessment difficult? Scale, consistency of marking and how we're giving these assessments to students, the time that it takes to give assessments and whether or not that's taking up a lot of instructional time, as well as teacher time for marking assessments as well, is a huge impact on time, and whether or not we're considering learning versus performance. Reid, do you have anything to add here?
I think that you've explained really well some of the complexities that are involved in assessments. And I think that sometimes in the busyness of our daily classroom practice or as assessment leads and other people responsible for assessment, we can sometimes look past that difficulty in those challenges. And sometimes we can become a little bit blasé about some of our assessment choices. So how we decide to assess student progress, how we support teachers to help their students prepare for assessments, and also how they might be sat, the conditions under which those assessments are sat. And then finally, as you've pointed to, the consistency of the marking, the ways that we take the information that sits within an assessment and then make an informed judgment about what it is that students are likely to know and be able to do as a result of the learning that's come before. So I think that you've done a really good job of investigating the field of some of the complexities of assessment. And I'm really hopeful, Sacha, that you've got some solutions for us in the next section.
Wow, how convenient, Reid, because I definitely do. So it's like we've planned this in advance. Okay, so I have painted kind of a bleak portrait here about all the problems with assessments, as you've said, Reid. But I actually think that assessment should be a bigger focus in schools. That's one of the reasons that we're here tonight. I think sometimes we associate assessment with reporting or exams mostly. This is when we will do a lot of assessment this time of year. I know I often have heard in my teaching career the phrase about weighing the pig and not feeding the pig. And so sometimes we really see all the limitations of assessment, which are valid, and we think that what we maybe should be doing is assessing students less. However, as Dylan Williams says, assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. So if your school is working hard on improving teaching, which most schools always are, no matter how well they're performing, then I think we actually need to be putting assessment at the center of our improvement journey. I listened to a really great podcast recently by Anna Stocky with Dr. Nuno Creto. He was a research professor of mathematics and statistics at the University of Lisbon, and then he became the Minister of Education in Portugal. It's a great podcast if you haven't listened. It's also on YouTube. He talked about how the evidence says that systems or countries who actually abolish exams start to perform worse than those systems where they keep their focus on exams and they make sure exams are a really rigorous part of their teaching. So I'm not necessarily saying that we do need to assess students more, but I am saying I think we need to think about how our assessments are designed and how they're used to improve learning. So that takes me to my next section, which is how can assessment improve or impact learning? All right, here's our next illusion. Well, this one's actually more of an experiment, and I'm giving away the ending. So if you haven't seen this, feel free to show it to someone else. It's a great experiment to have a look at. It's called the invisible gorilla. So at the start of this video, you're prompted to count how many times the ball is passed back and forth between this group of people in the white shirt. So you're supposed to be counting how many times passes you see between the people in the white shirts. Halfway through, somebody dressed in a gorilla suit walks through the scene. And most people completely miss this gorilla because they are focusing all of their attention on the ball and trying to count those passes. So this feels like a really long bow for me to be drawing, but hear me out. Attention is what drives learning, and what students attend to is what they think about and what they learn. And that's a really important thing for us to think about when it comes to assessment. So I lost my slide here. That's right. Oh, wait a second. Oh, here we go. So how does assessment impact learning? One way is attention. So before we've even given an assessment, teachers will often signal to students what's going to be on an assessment. I know that I've said to students in my classes, pay attention to this because it's going to be in your assessment. That's something that teachers say all the time. Or we provide practice exams, particularly going into VCE, that clearly show what content is going to be covered. So students are going to direct their attention towards specific knowledge or content as they start to form beliefs about what might be included. So by the very act of talking about it in upcoming assessment and having students prepare for it, we are focusing and directing their attention to the content that we want students to learn. The other way that assessment can impact learning is that it can really help students form beliefs about themselves as learners. And this is something to be very conscious of in the way that we speak about assessment as well. We really want to motivate students to do well. We can't always influence every student to really want to do well, but we can design assessments or use assessments that give everyone a level of success, that have some sort of low stakes. And as well, we really want to give assessments where students get some sort of measure of feedback on their result. So first, we need to make sure that students know how to do our assessment so that they can have a level of success. But we also want students to start to form a belief about how good they are at certain subjects by giving them some feedback about how they can improve. So it's really important that assessments are not something that are given to students and taken away. Assessments can really help students to sort of form that self-belief and motivate them to do well, as long as we give them that feedback in a meaningful way. Now, another really important way that assessment can improve learning and impact learning is the testing effect. So we know really well that testing helps students learn. So it strengthens memory and it makes knowledge stick. I'm sure we've all been in this position where when you're tested, you're having to recall information, you're quizzed on something that actually makes retrieving that information easier, makes that memory stronger. When students recall information, it strengthens their brain connections. It makes it easy to remember it next time. So testing helps build understanding by connecting ideas and making learning more flexible. And hopefully, it also helps students realize what they don't know, especially when we do low stakes quizzes or things like a review. Students start to recognize what they don't know and hopefully start to plan how to improve and how they can work on what they haven't learnt. And so, lastly, one of the biggest levers is using assessment to drive teaching improvement. And I think that's one of the most important things to talk about here tonight, which is that we really want to make sure that we're driving the idea that giving assessment and using assessment well can be the lever in your school to really help with improvement of instruction. So David Didow says that it's best to design assessments that are not telling us how good students are at our subjects, but how good we are at teaching them. So it's really easy to look at assessment results and focus entirely on the narrative of the student and what was going wrong or right for the student on that day. I know certainly I've been in that position in meetings where we've talked about a certain student and what was happening for them at home or in other situations. And that's important. You know, students are not numbers. Like, all students do have different stories, and we want to bring that sort of full picture. But when we're talking about using assessment to drive teaching improvement, we have to look at the bigger picture and not get too sort of stuck in the weeds. So if we're only focusing on one part of the story, we might not take the opportunity to use our data to change and improve teaching practice. So here's a few ideas then about how assessment can impact or improve learning. We know that making sure we're doing high quality assessments can focus student attention on what's most important. It can provide motivation for students to do better as long as they get feedback or results from these assessments. We know just the very act of testing students can help students learn and retrieve memories easier and in a stronger way. And lastly, we know that assessment can improve learning because it can improve teaching. And ultimately, that's our biggest lever. Reid, any thoughts?
I was just thinking as you were discussing then, Sacha, about that idea of focusing attention. And one of the interesting things about assessment is that focuses attention not just of the student, but also of teachers and schools. That when we're thinking about the assessments that we set, often it focuses us as teachers. It helps us understand what it is that we should be spending more or less time on as we're thinking about how we're going to apportion time in the classroom. And so it's just another reason why we need to think really carefully about the assessments that we develop and the assessments that we give, because it has impacts not only on the way that students interact with the teaching and learning in their class, but also the ways that we as teachers conceptualize our work and conceptualize a unit of study.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think I was reading in Harry Fletcher Wood's book about the idea of like powerful knowledge. So looking at a unit and deciding, you know, how many repetitions do students need of what really matters here. And then that is what we assess, basically that knowledge, and sort of then having a real focus on what that is. So yeah, great point. Thanks, Reid. So now, this next section, we're going to give some really practical ideas about, if you're leading assessment in your school, a few things to think about. And there's sort of two aspects to this. So one is leading whole school assessment. What do we need to think about, and what are some things that we need to do when we're leading whole school assessment? And then we're going to talk about leading a data meeting. So whether that's with a small team or a faculty or just you and your teaching partner, what are some things that you can do to really use assessment in an effective way? So when we talk about leading whole school assessment, somebody needs to have a big picture view in your school. And so schools are all different. This might just be a leadership team, or it might be an instructional leader. But often this doesn't happen enough. It's often there's not a lot of opportunities for everyone to be looking at whole school assessment. So here's our next illusion, everybody. This is rotating snakes. I won't keep this one too long on the screen because it is really hard to look at. So this illusion is really interesting because it looks like it's moving, but it actually isn't. So I'll give you a minute to have a good look, not get too dizzy. So when you look at one part, it stops moving, but all the parts around it start to move. So it's actually a static image. It's a trick of our perception. But I think it's really interesting because there's also some people who look at this and don't see any motion at all. Their sort of sense of perception is different, or I suppose their makeup is different, and they can't see that movement. So my longbow analogy here is that sometimes when we look at whole school data and assessment, it feels a little bit like this illusion. So is everybody seeing the same thing, or are we all sort of focused on all the individual parts and not looking at the whole? Is there something else that needs our attention? And so when we're thinking about whole school assessment, we need to sort of zoom out to see all of the context. Okay, so first step, if you're leading whole school assessment in your school, is to establish what systems are being used. So maybe this is controversial, but I think in lots of schools, we don't look at whole school assessment enough. You might look at NAPLAN maybe in a staff meeting once, but as a whole school, how often have you got all of your school's data together and really as a whole team or in a big team sort of how to look at the big picture and what's happening rather than maybe just sort of that national testing. So when you're leading assessment in your school, one of the first things to work out is what system is being used for all your whole school assessment. Are things kept in all different spreadsheets and not accessible to everyone? Is there some sort of platform or way that people are looking at assessment together? How can we get a whole school picture rather than having things sort of all over the place? And also who has access? So in your school, in your context, does the assessment live in a place where everybody can actually access that data? So sometimes there's not really one place where data is kept. Sometimes it's not accessible to everybody, whether it's some sort of platform or it's spreadsheets or it's a data wall. We have to make sure there's lots of people having a look at this data and looking at everything together to make a big picture. Next, another thing to establish is what marking system is used and why. I certainly know that there's some schools that don't have whole school agreement about how we mark and how we report to teachers, and some are using letter grades and some are using number grades. And there might be really good reasons for that, but as a whole school, have we sort of agreed on our marking schemes and how we've come to them and what an A is in this subject and what an A is in that subject? And most importantly, when are we looking at this whole school data? So do we have regular times and meetings where beyond sort of that NAPLAN time when that comes out in, term 3, term 4, sometimes there isn't actually a lot of opportunity to be looking at whole school data. And often it's, one team, it's not all teachers in the school. So this might not all be an important process in your school. It might be because the data maybe isn't seen as particularly valuable. It might be just the usual time constraints. But I think that establishing what the systems are so that all the data can be looked at together would be the first step in leading whole school assessment. So the next step would be, all right, well, now I've sort of got a handle on where all our data is, or managed to bring it all into one place. So next, it's what types of assessment are we actually using at our school? And it's really important that one of those types is standardized assessment. And a standardized assessment is an assessment that has the same questions and the same format for all students. Sometimes there's an adaptive element, but generally same questions, same format for all students. And this comes back to what I talked at the beginning about scale and consistency, the making sure that we have a standardized assessment that's really considered the design so that we have, it's has the ability to be scaled and it can be consistent as well. Now, the purpose for these assessments generally is evaluating broad groups of students. So this is something like NAPLAN or your sort of year 12 exams would fall into like a standardized assessment. And generally we're using these to compare either cohorts or to compare schools. There's usually set conditions like their online assessments or their offline assessments. There's usually teacher instructions that we're expected to follow, certain conditions students have to sit. And the sort of benefit of using a standardized assessment is that they are norm referenced. So this means that large groups of students have sat these assessments, and then we can place our students against those norms and sort of see how our students are tracking against others. Now, I know that sometimes it's really easy to dismiss standardized assessment like NAPLAN. They definitely do have limitations. Obviously, in a primary setting, students are only sitting it twice. I often hear people saying it's one test in one day. That's true. But we can't actually dismiss the role of standardized norm referenced assessments. So they're really helpful as a school to see if our judgments are in line with the achievement of other schools. It's also really helpful because the curriculum, whether you're using a state curriculum or you're using Australian curriculum, it can be really tricky to decide if your students are meeting those content descriptors. Sometimes people have different ideas about what the content descriptor might mean in terms of evidence or a work sample. And so having those standardized assessments means I can really see whether or not my students are doing as well as the students across the lake from me here in Ballarat. And so when you're thinking about what assessments you have in your school as a leader, I would definitely be looking where is there opportunity to have some well-chosen standardized assessments. Now, we also probably need to be using some screeners that allow us to find students that may need intervention. So that's where you might use something like a Cadence or Dibbles and be able to look for students that might need tier 2 or tier 3 intervention. And another assessment type that you might use would be a common assessment that's been sort of designed in school that meets sort of the units or the teaching outcomes that you're doing in your school. And it is worth thinking about how those have been designed because it is really difficult to write an excellent assessment. Ask me how I know. I've been doing a lot recently. So I do think it's worth them being part of the picture, but then thinking about what other data sources we have to make sure those assessments are, really effective and reliable. So we've got our systems and we've got our data. Well, what are we going to do with that? Ultimately, that's the whole point really of assessment is helping us to make good decisions about what we're going to do next. So one part of leading whole school assessment is making decisions about students. These are big picture decisions. So we're looking for trends across the school, maybe across year levels, maybe not so much at individual students in this meeting and decisions about individual students, but something like an intervention program. So not just who needs to go into intervention, but where are we going to put our funding for intervention next year? How many staff do we need to allocate to intervention? Have we had any success from intervention last year? Can we look at the tracking of those students and if they've actually shown more growth than maybe other students who weren't in that program? So an example of this is something we do at Pleasant Street. We do something called Students of Concern meetings twice a year where students, all our teachers have to come for a meeting with myself and the executive team and basically talk about students of concern, and we look at all of our whole school data for those students. And a student of concern is also a student who's shown a lot of growth or is operating well above, as well as those students that we're worried about that maybe haven't shown growth or, are tracking a little bit further behind. So it means we have accountability for our teachers that they have to be doing these assessments. They're due on a certain date. We have to be able to see that data, but it also helps us to form a really big picture view about our priorities as a school. What do our students need? What decisions do we need to make about resourcing? But the other really important part about whole school assessment is making decisions about your school's direction. And that's what these meetings, this work around whole school assessment is so important to help you make these decisions. And I know as a school leader, sometimes there's priorities that are coming from your system, that are coming from the school down the road, that certain teachers might be really keen on. And this is where having that whole school data can help you make that really informed, and practical and intentional decision about what comes next. So I really like Harry Fletcher Woods. He says 2 simple questions we should be asking. Did our approach to teaching this work? And are we improving? And I think that's a great 2 questions when you're looking at this data to sort of begin those discussions about what's next for our school. What sort of actions might you take? Professional learning for teachers, so picking a few things to do well based on your whole school data. Changes in whole school curriculum. So you might decide you need to bring in a new spelling program because the whole school data is telling you that's something that students might need. This might be where you make a decision to change how you're teaching fluency, for example, because you've got quite a bit of data and trend data to say that what you're doing at the moment is not effective. And another whole school direction decision that I think is really important to do in the context of whole school assessment is decisions about teachers. So placement for teachers, subjects that you're going to run or maybe not run, different allotments for teachers if you're in that secondary setting. I think making sure that you're looking at whole school data when you're making those decisions is also really important. So in summary of this section, when we're leading whole school assessment, some things to think about. What are the systems that we have in our school to make sure we can do this well? What assessment types have we got? And have we got something that is both standardized and norm referenced, as well as things that we might, want to use in our context? Are we using our whole school data to make decisions about students? And are we using our whole school data to make decisions about school direction? Reid.
Sacha, I think one of the interesting things about working in schools is we always have a plan. We have a plan for individual students. We have a plan for groups of students. We've got a plan for our entire year, and we call that plan the curriculum, whether it's our tier one provision or our tier two and tier three provision. We've got a plan, and we're all sticking to that plan because it's what we believe is the plan that's going to give our students the best opportunity to improve in the skills, knowledge, and understandings that we think is important for them to make progress in over the course of a year and multiple years. And one of the great things about assessment is it gives you a whole lot of information about a variety of different topics and different areas. One of the primary bits of information that it gives us is a judgment on our plan. So although we're focusing on students and groups of students and what they've learned over time, what we're really evaluating is not necessarily the student. We're evaluating our plan as individual teachers, as groups of teachers, and as a school. We're evaluating the plan for learning that we've had planned for them in the past, our curriculum, and we're starting to make decisions about our plan from here, the plan for learning for groups of students, for classes of students, for individual students. And it's one of the reasons why this discussion that we're having this evening about assessment and the way that we set up our assessment discussions is so important.
Thanks, Reid. I think that really makes me think about how sometimes we can be really attached to a plan and what we were going to do and why we were going to do it. I'm definitely guilty of that. And there's something about using assessment data to really investigate whether or not that plan is really working or whether or not I'm just really passionate about that plan. So it can take some of that emotion out of it and actually just make you have a more objective, I suppose, discussion about whether or not what your school's doing is really working. All right, so let's talk then about leading data meetings. And if you're a teacher who's a PLC leader or a faculty leader, this might be sort of your area that you're here tonight to sort of think about. What are some practical things you can do when you've got some assessment data and you want to make sure that you're using that meaningfully, even if you don't maybe have so much of an impact over the whole school data. But this is probably one of the most important parts of leading assessment, because this is where we can really make changes based on what's been happening using our data. So you knew it was coming. It's another illusion. It is our last one. I love this one. This is Ebbinghaus. So you might know Ebbinghaus for the forgetting curve and the spaced practice that comes from his research. And this is also his illusion. I thought that was a great one to end on. So in this illusion, the two orange circles, they appear to be different sizes if we look at these two orange circles, but they are actually the same size. Am I stretching this analogy too far? Probably, but I think with this, it makes me think about how, again, when we're in a data meeting, when we're talking to teachers about the kids that we, so passionately have been teaching, we're working so hard, sometimes your perspective can be skewed depending how sort of close you are to that data or how far away you are. So let's talk a little bit more about what we can do in these data meetings to make sure that they are effective and we're all looking at the data the same way. So firstly, we need to make a decision what data is being brought to our planning meeting or our data meeting. So in a whole school meeting, we might be looking at something like a large semester assessment or a NAPLAN or something like that. Generally, I think a planning and data meeting, it might be something that is more of a performance assessment. It might be work samples from students. It might be exit tickets. It might be a mid-unit assessment, a multiple choice about something that we're working on. Or it could be an end of unit test, but it is usually something that is perhaps a little bit smaller picture than some of the big picture stuff we were just talking about before. And so then what's the purpose of this meeting? And I think there's three really great ways to think about this, three different purposes that we can do. So one is this meeting about feedback to students? So for example, we might bring writing samples to a meeting and the focus is what feedback does my class or our classes need to improve this type of writing? I know we did this recently at Pleasant Street in year 3 and 4. We brought a bunch of writing samples in and we looked at the best writing and we thought, well, what did these things all have in common that we'd like everybody to be doing? What common trend can we see across our top writers? Another type of meeting might be a reteach meeting. So the goal here is to determine, do students have this concept so far or do we need to do some reteaching? So instead of just rolling on with the next lessons that we planned, do we actually need to do a bit of reteaching with a group of students or all of the students because they don't actually have the concepts solid enough yet for me to continue with this unit? And lastly, are we going to be doing a redesign meeting? And I think a redesign meeting is about improving this unit going forward, assuming that your school has sort of a low variance, consistent curriculum, or we're working towards that. Assessment is how we work on ensuring that we have some sort of process of iteration and improvement. If you're really working hard in your school about having a low variance curriculum, you have to evaluate how that's going and what it is that we need to do to make that better next year. So it's not just about deciding on your units, it's also then about improving those units year on year. So we've got what meeting, what assessment, and what purpose. And then next is probably to establish the norms. So, what are we bringing? Do we have accountability around that? Making sure teachers know what they're bringing and why they are bringing it. And then we probably need to set some norms in our meeting about how we discuss the data. So, I know that we can all fall into the habit of telling the story of the student or justifying why maybe the data didn't look so good on that day. It was the day after camp, it was really hot. There's always a reason why maybe we feel like the students didn't do as well as I know I taught it. They didn't seem to learn it as well as I taught it. We've all been in that position. And so, ideally, in this meeting, we're not really looking at every single individual student and explaining their performance. We're looking at the cohort as a whole objectively. So, it's really important to have that set up that norm with your teachers to make sure that we know that that's what we're doing here today. And then to establish what the goal is in our meeting. So, let's talk about those different types of meetings. All right, so feedback to students. Now, this could be an hour and a half or more to talk about what a meeting like this might look like. I remember once we had a really high level visitor come and visit a school I worked at a few years ago. And the visitor, as she walked through the school, she noticed that in lots of classrooms, the students were in a line waiting for the teacher's feedback on their narrative. And the kids had written these, 2, 3, 4 page narratives. And then the poor teacher was having to read through and write written feedback for each one. And so the main feedback we got as a school was, well, the students should be just writing their name on the board and then going and doing some busy work at their desk. I can see Jeanette's face while I say this. Now, I've come a long way. I've come a long way in my thinking and how I teach writing, but the issue of feedback still remains. How do we give feedback to students when they've done, some sort of piece of work? And we want to make sure that we do want to give them feedback to improve. That's part of our assessment process. So having a data meeting where we bring work samples and the purpose is about giving feedback and teaching a feedback lesson is a really nice focus for one of these data meetings. Now, there's some excellent sources to learn more about this. Daisy Christodoulou has written some really great pieces on her Substack. Dylan Williams talked a lot about making sure that feedback is productive. So it's not providing feedback is not enough. We have to make sure students have a chance to practice. So, for example, at Pleasant Street, when we had those writing samples, we picked 2 focuses that we noticed our top students were doing, and we taught a feedback lesson where we gave back all our work samples and we made sure everybody understood what we were trying to do, and we had them practice improving their writing using, that piece of feedback. And so that's a really nice way to have a data meeting would be, we're going to do a feedback lesson. We're going to be doing it on Monday. Let's look across the cohort. Let's make some assessments. What do we decide that we need to actually give feedback to improve everybody's writing? Now, another type of data meeting you might have is different. This is more a reteach. So we might be teaching an assessment on teaching a unit on fractions. Halfway through the unit, we've done some exit tickets or a check-in, or we've got their workbooks. And we've realised that there's just a few concepts that our students really need some more time on. It might just be a group of students need some repetition, or it might be all students. You might decide as a team, let's go and have a look at our teaching resources. Are there any specific reteach resources that we could be using? Or you might realise that we can probably put this into a different element of our construction, of our instruction. So can we do some more of this content in our do now? Can we do some more of this content in our review? And so another really powerful way to have these data meetings is to think, okay, we're doing a check-in halfway through the unit because we're planning for a reteach on Friday. Who needs to be part of that reteach and how are we going to do it? And lastly, if you're leading a data meeting, probably the most powerful way to have this meeting is to think about what do we need to do to improve the teaching of this unit? So it's not about how well they learnt it, it's how well, we taught it. It's about how well the students learnt it. And it's not just about thinking about, well, this student did this or this student did this. We need to be thinking about, what is it we've done as a team? Who has taught this really well? Which students have really got it? What is it we can improve on next time? And I think we do hear about schools who will look at an end of unit assessment and have these excellent discussions about which students did well or which areas did we do well and what can we add back to our materials to make sure that we teach this better next time. And this probably has the most impact, but it's probably the hardest meeting to run in a way because I think often we don't really want to have these discussions about our own teaching practice, but I know the evidence says that talking about teaching practice and how we can improve teaching practice actually has one of the biggest impacts on student outcomes. So leading data meetings, what do we need to do? So we need to decide on what data we're bringing and for what purpose we are meeting. We need to establish norms to make sure that it's a productive meeting that doesn't get stuck in the weeds about certain students or certain stories or, how good camp was or whatever. And then I think it's really helpful to have a single purpose for those meetings. Are we thinking about feedback for students and when are we doing this? Are we thinking about a reteach because the students don't have all the content they need to move on? Or is this more about a redesign and we're looking at this whole unit and what we need to do to teach it better next time? Reid, would you like to jump in here?
Always, Sacha. I think you've described some of the important thinking that leaders need to do in preparing for a meeting. As leaders within a school, you know how precious that time that we have allocated to bring teams together. It's one of the most precious investments in time that we have is to bring groups of teachers together and consider problems of practice in education. And so we can't waste that time because we can't get that time back and it annoys everyone who's at the meeting when they feel like we could have done this here in an email or what a waste of time this is. So the real underlying message under all of these is your preparation as a leader of assessment meetings is just so crucial that you've prepared really well, that you've thought carefully about the purpose of the meeting and how the meeting's going to be structured. And everybody within that meeting understands the role in the conversation, that they know what contributions are going to be positive ones and which ones are not, to maximize that amount of time so that it can influence the learning of our kids. Because the only reason we run these meetings is so that we can make better decisions about the learning of the children that are in our care.
Thanks, Reid. I agree. And I think that one thing that does make these meetings hard, as you said, time, definitely, and having a clear focus. And the other is the quality of assessment. Sometimes it's really hard to get a good assessment that everyone agrees on that does really match what you've taught. Because if you're going to have a discussion about assessment and people are sort of disagreeing about the assessment itself, then you've sort of stopped before you've even started. So I think that's also a really important thing to consider. So in summary, what have we talked about here tonight? I've shown you lots of illusions. I think that was the best part. But the content that we talked about was why is assessment difficult? Again, I think there's lots of reasons why, but we summarized some of those. The idea of scale and consistency, that's so important. But on the other hand, we have to think about time, how much time it takes to assess, how much that takes us instructional time, and how we make sure our assessments actually capture what students have learnt. How does assessment impact learning? That it's really important to be assessing students often and well because it does actually improve their learning. The very nature of giving an assessment can actually improve students' learning. That leading whole school assessment is a really important role in the school, and that big decisions we're making about students or big decisions that we're making about our school direction should come from looking at all of the data at once. And that sounds really easy, but I think is actually really hard to sort of look at all your school data at once, and is almost impossible to find somewhere where you've got everything together, like my excellent rotating snakes illusion. And lastly, leading data meetings, that for any teacher, this is a really, really key process to making sure that you're using data effectively. And we're not just using it to report to parents, we're using it to give feedback to students to improve, or to make sure that, we're on the right track with teaching, or to actually improve something that we've been teaching, and that we're not just sort of going along with a plan, we're iterating and improving something that we've spent a lot of time working on. So we know teachers, school leaders, they're making hundreds of decisions a day about teaching and learning. Assessment is one of the most powerful tools that we have to make those decisions count. So I'm not going to talk a lot about impact assessment here tonight, but I know we have been blown away with how much interest we've had from hundreds of schools who are really keen to learn a little bit more about impact assessment. So I said, well, we would do a little summary here at the end, and then give you somewhere you can go if you'd like to find out a little bit more about what we're doing. So impact assessment is actually part of Ochre Education. So Ochre Education has a mission to drive equity in Australian education. So our vision is that all teachers have access to high quality curriculum resources to maximise teacher expertise, so we can provide all students with the educational opportunities that they want and deserve. And Ochre Education is committed to ensuring that all of our core materials, including our assessments, are free forever. So that's not changing. But now we have impact assessment, and this is a social enterprise that's been established and is owned by Ochre Education. And the purpose of impact assessment is to provide schools and systems with everything that they need to benchmark student progress and address gaps in learning. So I know that as we've been working at Ochre for over 4 years, we've heard lots of times that a critical missing piece of improving school outcomes is assessment. And I know that I went up to Reid a few years ago at a conference and nearly bowled him over to say, what are we doing about assessment, Reid? That has to be the next step. So we know that high quality assessment is the driver for improving teaching and then ultimately student outcomes. And what's also great about impact assessment is all the revenue for impact assessment just goes directly back into supporting Ochre Education to maintain and improve all of our high quality resources. Where's my screen? Here we go. So again, there's lots of opportunities to hear more about impact assessment. In brief, a few of the features are that we have high quality assessments that are being written by subject experts, including new semester assessments that can be given. You can also add your own assessments, so you only need one platform school-wide. You don't have to be using Ochre materials to be using impact assessment. You can put all of your assessment data in one place. But there's excellent analysis tools that include teacher guidance for next steps in teaching. And there's also standardization across classes in your school and also across schools and systems. So you can compare your results to other schools when students have sat that same assessment. So if you would like to know more about impact assessment, we have an introductory webinar, which is next week, next Thursday night. And there's a link here to that. And that's the link right to the meeting. So you might want to take a photo of that so you can use it next Thursday rather than a registration link. Otherwise, there's also our website and you can go on there and register for a demo or to find out some more information. So here are all my sources, which I have not referenced properly, but I've done a lot of reading recently, and I think that some of these are excellent places to start. It's particularly for readings with staff. If you are leading a data meeting or you're working with staff to improve assessment, I highly recommend some of these sources. They're great. And lastly, thank you. It's been so great to come and talk to everyone here tonight about some of the thinking that we've been doing and research and reading. Reid, Dr. Reid, anything to add?
No, I think you've been very comprehensive, Sacha. I know I've been furiously writing down notes as you've been going, so I'm pretty sure that's been happening in the background too. And some lovely comments in the chat too, Sacha, about how valuable the sharing your expertise has been for people.
Hey, Sash, Anna Stocky, that's Stokke. So I think who's asked about that? Gabriella. And also, do you mind putting up the resources slide from earlier? Someone's just asked if you could
This one?
resources slide. Yeah.
This one?
That one there, I believe. Resources slide up again.
Sources, my sources. Yeah, definitely not appropriately university.
No, sorry, someone in the chat just asked for that list.
Yes, there you go.
And just while people popping a link into the chat, I think Nigel, if you take a photo, actually go back to the QR. Sorry, Sash.
Yeah, that's okay. No,
Nigel would just like Nigel, if you just grab a photo in a sec when this comes.
The one thing I can't do is make my slides do what I want tonight.
Hey,
they've gone rogue.
You can
the magic trick.
Talk it up really well, so you don't need your slides to work. You don't need slides if you can talk like that, Sash. Um,
Yep. So that's a direct, so it's not a registration link, it's just a direct
yeah,
link to the meeting. So pop it, take a photo of
yeah,
that so you can also I think it's been emailed out if you're on our email list, or I'm sure it'll be also on socials if you follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. I'm sure the link will be there. But it's
yeah.
next Thursday. It's just half an hour. And it's going to go a little bit more into impact assessment and all of the features of the platform. And then you can book in for a demo if your school is interested. We've got literally hundreds of schools
Coming
booked
along.
in,
Well, that I
which
think
is
that speaks
amazing.
to the need, which
Yeah, which is it does
is
speak to the
great.
need.
Is yeah, I took some notes as well. But and before anyone emails me, I always get a million emails. Is this recorded? Yes, it's recorded. Sign up for a free membership with Think Forward, and you can access any of our previous webinars. They're always recorded. This will be on our website, and I believe Oka are also sharing a copy of this as well. So we've got a question here. Western Australian curriculum has been added to impact assessment. Is this across secondary subjects?
Yep. So we'll have assessments for Western Australia, and all our assessments are foundation to year 10. So
Yeah,
across national and all the different state, New South Wales, Victorian, Australian
yeah,
curriculum. So yeah, they'll be aligned to all those different curriculums as well.
yeah. Well, that's great news. And I think, yeah, if anyone, while I'm waiting for anyone else to type anything into the chat, one of the things Daisy, who's my boss in another life, always talks about is that idea that of creating assessments is a real philosophical undertaking. You know, you cannot get into the mind of another person, especially a little person, try and work out what they know, and therefore curriculum and assessment go hand in hand, and we forget that part. And you know, we imagine that curriculum are these documents that we're handed that we teach to, but actually curriculum is what they learn, and we
Yeah.
only know that through quality assessment. And I think I bowled Reid over possibly at the same conference. And I remember him because I think in my previous somewhere in my previous 20 years of teaching, one of my favorite things was to create assessments. I always felt like it was this fun, creative thing that I used to do. And I heard Reid speak about, you know, that one of the great assessments is something that someone else has created, because then you can actually tell. There's no bias attached to it. And I remember thinking, oh, but there you go. You changed my life, Reid. And we've got here, yeah. So completely relatable. And I think, yeah, Sacha and Reid getting lots and lots of nice feedback in there. That so many different things that we've all had to cater to. And I think one of the things I get asked with No More Marking more than anything else is, even after they've looked at the comparative judgment process, is, yeah, but what progression will the students be? I think everybody wants that magic bullet. We very much think about progression in relating to reporting.
Mm.
Curriculum and assessment, you know, has to tick that box, but actually it's you know, it's what you need to teach next and how do we help them improve. So
Yeah. And I think we used to teach with a lot of pre-tests. Like now, a lot of schools have moved to low variance. People have dropped the idea of like a pre-test, and I think that's valid. But then we sort of think, oh, we don't need to do assessment because we know what we've taught. It's
yeah,
set every year. This is what we teach now.
yeah,
Rather than thinking, okay, well, that's what we've taught, but how do we know? And how do we improve is not just about maybe our feelings. It's also
yeah,
about, oh, okay, let's have a really good look at who's taught this really well and what did you do to do that
yeah,
so well? And yeah, I think but it's hard to have those discussions without some sort of evidence to be sort of talking to as well.
yeah. I remember sort of having a light bulb moment too when, you know, you think about the old triangle of the I do, we do, you do, show me. Remember the old, and I
Yeah.
realized once we got into it with lots of checks for understanding and, you know, every third or fourth slide having something come up where we were assessing what the children knew so far, you just realize what a waste of time it was to go through a whole 50-minute lesson and only check whether they picked anything up in the last couple of minutes.
That's right.
You know, it's just such a different model now. So I think this is such a great, so impactful for Australia to have some quality assessment that we can all rely on. So yeah, all the best of luck to
Thank
Oka
you.
and to you both. I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens next.
Great. We are
I
too.
think we're booked in Templestowe Heights for one of your sessions. So I will stop recording now. Thank you again, both.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Joel.